I think what I see as I look over these last 20 or 30 years of work on social protection and food security is the question posed by the title, two sides of the same coin. When I started working on rural development in Africa, which has always been my focus really, food security was, or food insecurity was the problem. I worked a lot on famines as well as regular chronic food insecurity. And then social protection came along and offered a whole range of solutions, or at least instruments that could partly address some food insecurity problems, let's put it like that. So social protection clearly is a policy agenda which talks very directly to problems of food insecurity. Whether they overlap completely is a more technical discussion, but we'll come to some of those debates later as well. Okay, so that's the context, if you like. Now, the Committee on World Food Security commissioned this report, this one here, Social Protection and Food Security, which you can download from the website, which was an attempt to bring these two agendas together. Food security and agriculture and nutrition are back on the agenda again. If you hang around long enough, everything comes back. So they're all back on the agenda again. And social protection is already there, so let's try and pull them together. So just a bit of background on the CFS and the HLPE. The CFS was reformed after the food price crisis, when it was recognized that global governance of food security wasn't working very well. And one of the things that they did in the reform process is that they set up a semi-independent body called the High-Level Panel of Experts, which was intended to provide independent, cutting-edge research, or at least state-of-the-art reviews of evidence on topical issues, which could inform policy, especially for the member states of the CFS. So it's meant to be fairly accessible, it's meant to be putting together rather than original research, and I think it's meant to be very policy-oriented as well. So that's a little bit of the context of the institutional context, if you like, of this report. One of the main activities of the High-Level Panel of Experts is to commission 2 reports every year. They have this very tight cycle where they churn out these 2 reports between October and June every year. And so the first year, they produced 2 reports following the food price crisis about price volatility, and also about land tenure, which is really focusing on land grabbing as a very topical issue. And the second year was my year, when I worked on the social protection report, and at the same time there was another one on climate change. So 4 reports in 2 years, and right now, those have been published. Right now, they're in the middle of the 3rd cycle, which is producing a report on biofuels and another one on smallholder investment. So you can see they're not scared to take on big politically charged issues. And I think I got off lucky, because in my year, climate change got all the political attention and I was left alone because everybody likes social protection. So it was quite an easy one to do politically. So the reports are meant to be both evidence-based. They're meant to review what we know, what the state of knowledge is about a topic. But also, they're meant to be used for advocacy. And that gave us an interesting dilemma, if you like, because it's not easy if you're working with, there was a team of 5 of us, including a World Bank economist. And the World Bank economist was very keen on the evidence side of things, but we also had a human rights lawyer who focuses very much on the right to food, and she wanted to do more on the advocacy side. So bringing those 2 together and trying to make a coherent statement, which was both evidence-based and advocacy, was probably the main challenge that I faced as a team leader for this report. Okay, so what does the report say? Well, the question obviously that we have to ask is, what do we mean by social protection for food security? What does the title actually say? And the title's got these 2 elements. Social protection. So social protection, these are not technical definitions, these are just popular definitions. But social protection is a range of instruments that address poverty and vulnerability, and of course that includes food insecurity, by social assistance, which means transfers mainly, cash for food transfers, by social insurance or social security, like unemployment insurance or pensions, and measures to promote social inclusion, which is, if you like, the more rights-based side of social protection. That's not included in all definitions, but we had it in ours. And food insecurity, again, not the technical definition, because once you get into that minefield, you could be all day just talking about that definition. But we talked about food insecurity as being the inability to secure enough food today and the risk of being unable to do so in the future. So that includes the dynamic dimension, because it's about vulnerability. It's not just about your current state, it's about what might happen to you tomorrow. So when we talk about social protection for food security, bringing these two together, we're talking about using social protection instruments in order to promote the human right to adequate food for all. So you can see there already we're trying to bring together this technical agenda, which is a bunch of social protection instruments, with the political objective of securing the right to food. And that's, I would say, if there's any innovation in this report, which, as I said, is basically a literature review, I think that's where it's innovative. It's trying to pull those two agendas together. And these are the rights that we are drawing on: the right to adequate food, which is well established. And for social protection, we're drawing on the right to social security, which there's a big debate, which we could discuss if you want to, about whether social protection is bigger than social security or whether social security covers social protection, which one is inside the other one's circle. But basically, social protection and social security we're using interchangeably in this report. So we're drawing on those two rights from the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Okay, here comes a conceptual framework, and I think this might be hopefully the only one that you can't see too well, but I won't spend too much time talking about the detail. I want to just frame what we mean by social protection instruments in terms of this analytical framework, which is just a way of organizing different social protection tools, if you like. So if you take some kind of poverty line, usually, it could be $1 a day or it could be a food poverty line, and you have people that are already below the poverty line, they need social assistance if they are unable to generate an independent livelihood, so that could be cash transfers or food aid. So that's on the bottom left. And that pulls them up towards the poverty line. We don't find with most social protection programs that people actually escape from poverty just by the social protection program. They're often too far below the poverty line, and the transfers are too small and erratic to get them out of poverty, but it at least makes them less poor. So it reduces the poverty gap, even if it doesn't reduce the poverty headcount very much. On the other side, you have people that have livelihoods or potential for livelihoods, and they can benefit from income-generating activities. And for those people, you would link the social protection program to asset creation, so providing access to assets, which would help people actually escape from poverty, which is why that arrow goes above the poverty line. And down here, you have what we're calling the twin-track approach, which is combining social assistance with support for income generation. And I'm going to spend more time talking about two of these instruments because they're actually quite interesting in terms of this connection between social protection, which is seen often as a welfare type agenda, with livelihood promotion, which is seen more as a developmental agenda. Above the line, you have risk management tools. And of course, as I said, food security is also about getting enough food tomorrow. So if you are a farmer and you face a drought, or if you are employed and you lose your job, what happens? If you are in a formal employment situation, you might have access to social security, but if you are informal sector or self-employed farmer, you probably don't. So there are mechanisms which are now being pulled into the social protection umbrella, which include crop and livestock insurance or weather indexed insurance. And of course, contributory social insurance would fit in that as well. Social security fits in there as well. And finally, on the right-hand side, I would like to just emphasize that social protection has become increasingly reduced, if you like, to a set of targeted interventions which are delivered to individuals or households. But we shouldn't forget that often the structural problems that people face are better addressed by structural interventions. So risk reduction measures, which could operate at the sector level, for example, stabilizing prices by managing a national grain reserve, where the government buys grain after the harvest and then releases it later on when food prices start to rise. That could stabilize the food prices without targeting individuals with cash transfers or food aid. And those mechanisms are not so popular these days. So when we look at the social protection menu, we tend to focus very much on social assistance and social insurance. We don't focus very much on risk reduction measures that operate at a higher level, although in my personal view, I think this is a mistake. I think we have neglected those sector level or macro level interventions with this focus on individualization of social protection programs. So we want to talk about those macro or meso level interventions as well. Okay, I'm now going to talk about two instruments in detail. In the report, we focus on 10 from that menu, from that framework, but I've chosen two that are interesting because they are controversial and because they illustrate many of the arguments that we make in the report more generally. So if you want to pick up on any of the other instruments that I don't talk about now, you can certainly do that in discussion. I'm going to talk about public works programs, and I'm going to talk about conditional cash transfers. So public works programs are temporary employment programs which are created in response to poverty and food insecurity, which is caused by unemployment or underemployment. So, for example, people who are farming for half the year, but half the year there's no work while they're waiting for the next rainy season, they could benefit from temporary employment during those 6 months. Now, public works programs are an example of a twin-track approach, which we advocate quite strongly in the report, because on the one hand, they support short-term food security by giving people a cash wage or a food ration, cash for work or food for work. And at the same time, the work that people are doing on these projects is meant to generate useful assets. So often people are building roads, or in this case, this is from a project I looked at in Rwanda. They're actually terracing a hillside to make land available for farming. And you'll find lots of soil and water conservation activities, but also community infrastructure like school buildings can be built with public works as well. So there's two objectives here, short-term and long-term food security. And of course, public works programs are extremely controversial. So the evidence shows, the review of evidence that we looked at, shows that they are effective for many reasons. One reason is that they are self-targeting, and that's one reason that they're very popular with governments and donors, because it's very difficult often to identify who are the poorest, who should benefit from a program. But public works programs are self-targeting because it's hard work and you don't get paid very much. So most of us wouldn't really want to go and dig a road for 6 hours a day for 3 kilograms of rice. But often that's what you're doing on public works projects. So that makes it targeting the very poorest. It's effective against shocks and seasonality because it provides that safety net. It provides an employment-based safety net which can smooth consumption over good and bad years or between hungry season and harvest season. And it can create useful infrastructure, but emphasis on the word can, because one of the controversies about public works is how effectively they do actually create useful infrastructure that is sustainable. So let's come to the critiques of public works programs. The first one is that obviously the work requirement, well, it is obvious, but it's not often thought through. If you have people expending a lot of energy digging a road, and then you give them a bit of food at the end of the day, or a bit of cash to buy food, you have to reduce the net value of that transfer by the amount of energy they've expended. And there's one notorious case from the literature when a project, I think it was in Niger, people were getting paid a food ration for a food for work project, but when you measured their anthropometric status, they were actually worse off after the project than before. They expended more energy digging the road than they actually received back in terms of payment. So that's not a good outcome. There's also an ethical question about the self-targeting. Is it ethical to pay people very low wages? Because if you have mass poverty in a rural area, you have to set the wage really, really low just to attract the 200 or 300 people that you need to build the road. So you make it so low that it becomes, I would argue, unethical, below the market wage rate, definitely. If you're making people do heavy labor, then that excludes people who can't do heavy labor. So older people, people who are ill, many women who are either labor constrained or time constrained and can't do that work. And finally, as I said, the assets that are created often don't benefit the poor directly. In the case of this project, it actually does. So this is a good example of where you can make the asset useful for the people working on the project. But often, of course, because it's labor intensive, it's not going to be very high quality public works. So sometimes buildings that are built, classrooms and so on, don't last very long, roads deteriorate, and often there's no budget for maintenance. When the project ends, that's it. So the asset starts to deteriorate quite rapidly, and sometimes you end up building the same road over and over again every few years. So these reasons have made public works controversial. But despite all this, I personally am not opposed to public works. I think a lot of these questions are design issues. And a lot of the problems that we have with social protection programs, which are controversial, can be solved by good design. So there's no reason why we couldn't apply decent work principles to public works programs. There's no reason why you have to use the wage rate as a self-targeting mechanism. You can pay people a decent wage and use another mechanism for targeting. In some cases, employment is rotated. So you work for a month and then somebody else, another group of people come work for a month and so on. Or you can use other mechanisms for identifying who should be on the program. You can also make sure that people who can't work on the public works still get access to social protection by some other means. So in many cases, there's a large program in Ethiopia called the Productive Safety Net Program, which is 80% public works, but then 20% is unconditional cash transfers to people who can't work. And that covers the problem of some people not being able to access the social grants because they can't deliver the work. You can also design lighter work for women, and sometimes public works projects have got a creche where women working on the project leave their children with other women who can't do the work on the road project, for example. And for example, this baby here, that baby there should be in the creche, which could be run by some other woman. And finally, in terms of making sure that projects are useful for the local people, you involve the communities. Obviously, that would be a way of getting around that problem. Make sure that the communities help to decide which projects are selected, and also make sure a maintenance budget is built in so that the asset doesn't deteriorate immediately after the project ends. So my point about public works, to sum up, is it's a controversial instrument, but it shouldn't be thrown out because it has lots of potential to be done well. The problem is we hear a lot of bad stories. We're used to in the past. It's improved a lot. But those bad stories tend to give public works a bad name. So I think a large part of it is about how you design it. And if you design it well, you can get around a lot of these problems. So I'm going to move on to another very controversial one, which is conditional cash transfers. Now, conditional cash transfers are cash that's given to poor people, usually to mothers or caregivers, but only with certain conditions. And the conditions are meant to be socially progressive conditions. So it's making sure that the children in the household go to school, that they get immunized, giving nutrition education to the mothers, those kinds of things. Who could disagree? So conditionalities are applied in order to achieve secondary objectives. So the first objective, this is again a twin-track program, the first objective is to reduce short-term food insecurity or poverty by giving the household a cash transfer, which they can use for anything they like. There's no condition on the cash transfer. So it's an unconditional cash grant, but with conditions on the behavior of the household, not on the use of the grant. But the conditions are meant usually to build the human capital of the children in the household, hopefully with the longer term objective of they'll be better educated and better nourished and healthier, so they'll get better livelihoods when they grow up. They'll perform better at school, and when they grow up they can get an income which will get them out of poverty. So the objective is ambitious, to try and break the intergenerational transmission of poverty. We don't have evidence on this because although CCTs have been going for about 15 or almost 20 years now, especially in Latin America, that still isn't a whole generation. What we really need to do is track children from these households and see what happens to them when they grow up. Are they actually going to grow up to be less poor than their parents? Are they going to escape poverty? So we don't have evidence on the longer term effects yet. But we do have evidence on their positive impacts, and they do certainly have positive impacts. So definitely the evidence is very conclusive. CCTs improve food security. People who get these cash transfers do spend them on food, and they get a more diverse diet, a better quality diet. And of course, because the conditions are linked usually to education and health, you'll find that children in these households do go to school more often. They are more likely to be immunized. So you see these increases in attendance rates, enrollment rates, and immunization rates. Very importantly, they get a lot of political support, because in countries where social protection programs are financed domestically by taxpayers, the middle classes tend to prefer that the poor do something in return for getting the cash, rather than just getting handouts. So you'll find a strong ethos, a strong rhetoric against unconditional cash transfers, because people say this just creates dependency, it makes people lazy, poor people should go out and look for jobs, all those kinds of things. But at least with a conditional cash transfer, the poor people who get the cash are supposed to do something for themselves. So there is a political support for these programs that you don't often get for unconditional grants. Okay, so what's the controversy? Sounds good. But here are some more reasons why they are unpopular than reasons why they are popular. So firstly, when you introduce a conditionality, it makes the program more expensive. You have to monitor compliance, and that can be a large part of the program budget. If people aren't complying, you have to decide what to do. Do you kick them out of the program, in which case you've denied them a right to a cash transfer, if it's a rights-based program? Or do you go around to the household and try and find out what the problem is, do a sort of caseworker approach, and support the household to get the kids back to school or whatever it is? And that all takes time and resources, which many low-income countries don't have. Secondly, there's no point having a conditionality on education or health if the education and health services aren't there, or they're very poor quality. So we shouldn't, one of my complaints about conditional cash transfers is that they assume that parents are irrational, that they're not sending the kids to school and clinic because they don't see the point of it. But maybe there is no point in sending the kids to schools and clinics if the school education quality is so poor that they're not learning anything, or if they just go to the clinic and get Disprin or Panado every time. So if the services aren't there, accessible, or of good enough quality, it doesn't make sense to force parents to comply with these conditions. There's also an empirical debate which is at the moment unresolved. This is one of the cutting-edge issues in conditional cash transfers, about whether the conditions are actually necessary to achieve these desired outcomes at all. So the question is, if you give people cash, is that enough for them to spend some of this extra cash on education and health services anyway, or do you need to force them to do it with a conditionality? And the evidence that we have from unconditional cash transfers is that households do buy health and education services with some of that cash anyway. So it might be that it's an income constraint rather than a behavioral constraint, if you like, that needs to be addressed. There's a gender complaint as well about conditional cash transfers, which is that all the pressure for compliance tends to end up being on the mother or the caregiver, who's often usually female. And that means that the mother and the caregiver is the one who has to make sure the children are going to school and clinic. And nonetheless, the cash often ends up in the hands of the man in the household. So more pressure on the women, but not necessarily more benefits to the women. And one more, there's this rights question. And as I said at the beginning, we are looking at social protection from a rights-based perspective in this report. There is a question about whether it makes sense to attach conditions to social transfers that should be a right. If you believe in the right to social security or the right to social protection, how can you deny that right just because people don't behave in the way that you think that they should? So there is a question about the ethics of applying a conditionality to what should be a rights-based program. So in fact, conditional cash transfers are not rights-based programs. They can't be. One more point. Any cash transfer, not just conditional, any cash transfer is vulnerable to food price inflation, either seasonal price variations or food price spikes like we had in 2007-08. So on the right-hand side here, you can see what happened to food prices in Ethiopia in 2007. They shot up dramatically. And of course, cash transfers that were implemented in Ethiopia through the safety net program at that time were not index linked. So they didn't follow the rising food prices. So the value of the cash transfers fell dramatically, which always happens when cash transfers are not index linked, and most cash transfers aren't. At the bottom, you have an example of a seasonal food price increase, which happened in Malawi. So the line is a food price trend. You can see how it goes up and then it falls when the harvest comes in. But for those 3 or 4 months before the harvest, prices were very high, as they are every year. And in this case, there was actually a program, which is represented by the bars, that gave people enough cash every month to meet the rising price of food until it started coming down, and then they reduced the cash transfer. So that was an example of where prices were index linked at the local level every single month. But it's an extremely complex operation to do, and I personally don't think it'll ever be replicated. It was extremely expensive and difficult for the donor and the NGO concerned, but they did try and make sure that prices, cash transfers were adequate to buy the same basket of food, whatever the price. So as the food price went up, so did the cash transfer. But without that kind of index linking, you're going to find that cash transfers lose their value as prices rise. Okay, so those are 2 instruments. We looked at 10, as I said. There are others in the report. But social protection is not just about instruments. It's about systems. Or in this part of the world, it's about flaws, social protection flaws, which I'll also talk about. So to sum up about instruments, it's quite an interesting paradox that social protection is very popular in theory. Everybody says, great, we like social protection. But then when you look at instruments one by one, you find lots of controversy about them. You know, public works, conditional cash transfers, school feeding. These are not subsidies. Any type of subsidy raises all kinds of alarm bells. So there are paradoxes around this. And my own view is that a large part of it is bad design, because in principle these are good programs. They have good ideas. But then in practice, they can be badly implemented or badly designed, so you get the wrong kind of outcomes, or you get suboptimal outcomes. So often what's needed is just to improve the design and make sure it's implemented properly. But design, and we're learning a lot from evaluations about how to improve the design of these programs so that they can be transformed from problematic programs to really successful programs. In terms of which instruments, this is a question we were also asked. How do you decide? Do you want to have a school feeding program or a public works program? My own view on this, and it's in the report, is that you should do some kind of analysis of what the problem is before you come along with a solution. And that sounds straightforward, but it's not how the world works, because in the real world you have donor agencies that have food, you have donor agencies that have cash, you have donor agencies that are in favour of conditional cash transfers, and those that prefer school feeding. So it's often a political decision rather than based on a needs assessment, but really it should be based on a needs assessment, and a national government-owned program would be based on a needs assessment rather than donor agendas or whatever resources are available. Another point to make is that it's not just about one instrument. There is no single instrument, and anybody who thinks that all the problems of poverty and food insecurity can be solved with cash transfers is wrong. You need to have a bunch of interventions. Different people have got different problems. Food security is very complex. So you need to have a set of interventions that address different food insecurity issues, and you should also be linking those programs to other sectors. Because, for example, if you're going to have a conditional cash transfer, that's a demand-side intervention, increasing the demand for health and education. The supply side must be adequate. So health and education services must be strong enough to absorb the extra demand that a conditional cash transfer is going to generate. So you have linkages also to productive or economic sectors like agriculture and employment preferably, so that you don't just generate huge social protection programs in isolation from the wider economy. And finally, a very important issue, which is again part of the new emerging rights agenda, is that we argue that accountability mechanisms are very important to make sure that instruments, programs, policies are implemented effectively. And those accountability mechanisms should operate at the national level, which means ultimately there should be a social contract between governments and citizens or residents, which means that everybody knows what their entitlements are and that you can claim those entitlements. So we shouldn't just be looking at discretionary projects where a project arrives in your village for 6 months and you're lucky if you get on it and then it stops. And it should be based on national systems which are claims-based. So you know you're entitled to a pension because you're 65 years old and you are poor. And at the program level, we should have, and most programs are now thinking more and more about introducing this, some kinds of grievance procedure or complaints mechanism where people who feel that they have been unfairly excluded from the program, for example, can go and make their case and try and get on the program. Or if your payment doesn't arrive on time, or if there's a corrupt official who's taking half your money, you can go and get that rectified. And that builds accountability from the bottom up. So we're talking about top-down accountability with the social contract idea, but also bottom-up, making citizens able to claim their entitlements from the state and to hold the program implementation people to account. So moving from instruments to systems, I'm now going to talk about a few issues around systemic approaches to social protection. And one which is very topical at the moment, very popular again, is graduation. And graduation basically means that people who are on a program should not stay on that program indefinitely, but at a certain point should exit the program. So if you are, for example, getting some kind of livelihood support, then you should at some point not need that livelihood support any longer. And at that point you exit the program because you are either food secure or you're not poor anymore. But the question then is, how do you define the appropriate point that people should exit the program? And what happens if you are out of the program for a year, but then you fall back into poverty or food insecurity? Do you get back on the program, or are you out forever? So there's also very interesting questions around this whole notion of graduation. But let me give you two examples of how it's being applied in practice. The one is a BRAC project in Bangladesh, and this one is extremely successful. I must say I haven't been to see it myself, so I'm not sure, but for what I've read about it, it's very convincing. Hundreds of thousands of women have apparently graduated from extreme poverty to moderate poverty, which doesn't mean they got out of poverty altogether. They haven't got above that poverty line, but they've made it above the extreme poverty line, which is a big achievement. And they've done that by a combination of interventions that are targeting different people at different stages or different levels of poverty. So at the real bottom, you start off with direct support or cash transfers or food aid. I think it's usually cash transfers. And then after a while, you start to build a savings culture, because what they want to do ultimately is get people into microcredit. They're very microcredit focused. But they provide skills training, and they also provide an asset at a certain point. So the asset transfer here is what lifts this program from just a social assistance program, which is enough to keep you alive but doesn't do much more than that, to a poverty reduction program, because the asset is a livelihood asset. It's access to land or an access to a cow or some other productive asset which will generate future streams of income. And once you've got that in place, then you should be up on an upward trajectory out of poverty. So with the combination of cash, assets, coaching or training, and eventually microcredit, you're supposed to move from extreme poverty towards a sustainable livelihood. Now, as I said, I haven't evaluated the program myself, but the evidence suggests that there is a lot of success, at least in terms of moving people up from very low level to a moderate level of poverty, not necessarily out of poverty altogether. Another example from Ethiopia, where the food security program also combines a range of instruments which target what they call the ultra poor, chronically food insecure, and then eventually you become food secure. And food security is defined in a very interesting way in Ethiopia as the ability to feed your family for the entire year and to withstand a moderate shock. So that's got some notion of resilience built into it. And one of the critiques that people make about graduation thinking is that it doesn't necessarily mean that people are resilient against future shocks, usually, just that you've crossed an income threshold or an asset threshold or a poverty line, but there's no guarantee you're going to fall back, that you won't fall back. And this program, the definition of graduation includes a notion of resilience, that you can withstand a future shock. So again, it's a combination of measures. It's cash transfers or sometimes food transfers, which is the consumption support or social assistance component. And then there's also livelihood support, which is usually a livelihood package, like to help you keep bees so you can sell honey, that kind of thing, which generates an independent income, and that should put you on the upward trajectory towards getting food secure and out of poverty, or at least getting out of food insecurity. Okay, so graduation is one of those topics which is very popular, again, with donors and governments, because it gives them an exit strategy. If you don't have a graduation-oriented program, then you risk having a permanent program which is expensive, and governments and donors are very scared of committing indefinitely to programs. But if you have a program like this one in Ethiopia, where the government said within 5 years we want to have so many people graduated, and now it's been going for 10 years, so at the end of next year it's actually supposed to have graduated all the participants, which is a lot of people, about 8 million people. So we'll see. By next year they might have graduated all those people or not. And then what happens after that is an interesting question. Okay, so the second point about the systemic approach or systematic approach is that we look very strongly at rights-based approaches. We argue that a sustainable approach to social protection must be rights-based. And there are, interestingly, a range of examples of where this is now happening. And interestingly enough, these are all from the BRICS countries. So these are not the poorest countries where you tend to find much more resistance to introducing rights, especially to rights on claims from the state, which are very expensive. But in Brazil and India and South Africa, we find right to food in the Constitution of Brazil, which is an organic law for food and nutrition security, and a range of programs that are introduced to try and achieve the zero hunger objective, which is a very famous objective of Brazil's social policy. In India, we have a whole bunch of rights. I mean, there's more rights than people in India, and there's lots of people in India. But there is the National Food Security Bill, which aims to guarantee food security to every citizen. And there's this famous National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, now called the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. And that has this incredible guarantee that every household in rural India has the right to claim 100 days of paid work at the local minimum wage within their local area, which is incredible, really, because it is essentially a food for work or cash for work project, but it's completely reversed from a supply-driven top-down approach to a demand-driven one. So that's real effective social protection, because it's people claiming their need for work or income when they need it, not when the project arrives in your village. So this is a small design change which actually radically alters the whole approach to public works. It turns it from a you're lucky if you get a project to a right that you can claim from the state. Of course, the issue in India is implementation. So you have variable implementation across states. In some states it's going quite well, in other states not very well at all. But the right is there, and it's something that other countries in the region are also adopting. It hasn't come to Africa yet, but hopefully it will come to Africa soon. In South Africa, we have, South African, we have a range of social grants. We have 7 social grants, actually, which are all acts of parliament. So they're all underwritten by law. And there's an example from the child support grant, for instance, which was introduced in 1998 for children, poor children up to the age of 7. And we have a very strong civil society in South Africa, which mobilizes around lots of issues. And so the civil society mobilized and said, well, the Constitution says a child is any person up to 18, so you can't just restrict it to children up to 7. And so progressively it's been increased from 7 to 12 and 14 and now 18 years. So every child who is in a poor household under the age of 18 is entitled to get the child support grant. And currently that's about 10 million children. So it's a huge program. And the evidence, empirical evidence on impacts is very powerful. The social grants do have a big impact on food security outcomes. And one famous example that I've quoted here is if you're a child in a household where there's a pensioner, especially a woman, a grandmother, for instance, then you're going to be 3 centimeters taller when you grow up than similarly poor children that don't have pensioners supporting them. So the social pension schemes have been very important, not just for the pensioners themselves, but also for the children who depend on the pensioners. One thing that's interesting about the social grant system in South Africa is that there's no graduation thinking. This is all very much welfare, social welfare type thinking. And there's a debate going on right now about whether this is sustainable, because the links from social protection to labour markets are not very strong in South Africa. Brazil has been much more successful in actually getting people out of the social grant system by creating links to labour markets and getting people into jobs. And that's there's some lessons there that perhaps South Africa could learn from, because what we seem to see is social grants increasing all the time, but unemployment still being very, very high. Okay, the last issue is social protection floors. Now, I'm sure most of you have heard of the social protection floor. It's a very successful mobilization of the UN system, which was led by ILO with WHO, and in fact it's now been approved as a recommendation. So it's all member states are now supposed to implement some kind of social protection floor as of June last year. The social protection floor is a very interesting idea because it's extremely ambitious when you think about it. What they're trying to do is make sure that every individual in a country has got income security throughout the life cycle, so children, working age adults and older people, and also universal access to healthcare. It doesn't have to be free handouts of cash or health coupons or whatever, but you have to make sure that everybody is covered somehow. Everybody has access to healthcare either through their own means or through public provision, and income security for people that can't earn their own income, that aren't independent, don't have their own livelihoods, that must be provided somehow. So you must have, at some point, coverage across the entire population in terms of income and healthcare. So you have the horizontal coverage, which is the universal access, and then vertical means the level of protection. So after some time, you can start raising the benefits or the transfers that are paid to people to try and raise their income standards. But the first point is universal access. So it's a rights-based approach. It's very strongly rights-based because it says everybody has the right to healthcare, everybody has the right to income security, and based on the social security right. And the social protection floors will be designed differently in different countries, but every country should try and achieve these two objectives. Now, in our report, we reviewed the social protection floor, and we said, well, it sounds great, and we don't disagree with the idea, but it's not really focusing enough on food. So we had this discussion about whether the social protection floor was good enough to guarantee food security. And this debate is actually ongoing right now. There was a meeting yesterday at ILO where this issue was discussed. And our argument is that income security is necessary but not sufficient for food security. And I think that the social protection floor would argue that if you have enough income to buy food, then you are food secure. but we say that there are other things that also need to be done to achieve food security. So the CFS, when they received this report, they reviewed this discussion and they came up with a proposal, which is that the CFS Bureau should explore further ways of integrating food security and nutrition issues in social protection flaws. And that's where we are now. That's where the debate stands. So the social protection flaw is out there. It exists. It's going to be implemented in most countries. But we feel strongly that food security needs to be reflected more, visibly in the social protection flaw than it is. So, for example, if you look back at the diagram, it says access to essential healthcare and minimum income security for all, which implies food security but doesn't actually state it explicitly. So we just think that there are ways that it could be made more explicit, and that discussion is ongoing between the relevant UN agencies and others. Okay, to conclude. In the report we came up with a lot of recommendations. Some are for the CFS and some are for member states. And these are for member states. So some of the ones that I thought were worth highlighting. Firstly, we say that every country should put in place a social protection system that contributes to the right to adequate food for all. So the social protection systems should be focused on this basic right. We also argue in favour of twin track approaches, a twin track strategy that provides short-term assistance to people that are food insecure or poor, but also supports their longer-term livelihoods. So public works, conditional cash transfers, but any mechanism that provides people with the capacity to escape from poverty, not just a handout, is preferable to just a handout. But you also need handouts. Some people won't be able to escape poverty. We should also focus on vulnerability. A large part of the agenda on social protection has been taken up by people that are interested in poverty reduction, and they see social protection as a way of getting people out of poverty. But the basic objective, in my view, has always been to protect people against shocks and downside risk. So the old-fashioned safety net idea is still really, really important. And that means that social protection should be there when people need it. So it should be demand-driven, like the NREGA in India. And it should be scalable. It should expand when it's needed. So you can have a program which brings in more people during a bad year, during a drought or a flood, for example, and then contracts again when that crisis is over. We also argue that it should be underpinned, social protection systems need to be underpinned by the human rights to food and to social protection or social security. You could, for example, put a framework law in place like they've done in some countries like Brazil, which specifies which ministries are responsible for delivering food security and gives you a list of programs and instruments that are going to try and achieve that. And so that's from the top. And then underneath, you need to have these accountability mechanisms I mentioned to make sure that actually there is some delivery on these, on what's promised in the framework law. And finally, I haven't mentioned this at all so far, so I thought I should end with making this point. A large proportion of the world's poor and food insecure are people who produce food, smallholder farmers, and that's still the case, and will probably stay the case for quite a while. So we should not neglect agricultural livelihoods, and it's good that agriculture is back on the agenda for that very reason. So food security objectives of social protection need to focus very strongly on supporting smallholders who produce food. And that's my final point. So thank you very much. If you want to see the FAO report, there's the website. If you want to look at our publications, there's our website. Thank you.